next talk, we have Dr. Poonam Thakur. And before going on to her introduction, as you observed right now, Dr. Thakur has been immensely supportive and encouraging in all our efforts. And we've been extremely lucky to have her as a mentor in our scientific advisory committee at Project Encephalon. And she has been instrumental in the success of Project Encephalon and the Neuro November Convention. So Dr. Thakur is a faculty at IISER Thiruvananthapuram. She is a recipient of the Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance Early Career Fellowship. Her long-standing research interest is to understand the pathophysiology of Parkinson's disease using animal models and to identify potential therapeutic targets. And in the quest of the same interest, she has worked as a postdoctoral scientist in the lab of Professor Jochen Rieper at Goethe University, and also in the lab of renowned scientist Professor Anders Jocklund at Lund University, Sweden. Throughout her research, she has won numerous laurels, including the prestigious Young Scientist Award by International Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Society. And she's won international travel awards, published several first author papers, and served as a reviewer for leading international journals. Um, so before Dr. Thakur comes on board, I would request the members of the audience to write Q for a question in the chat box and C for a comment. And with that, I think we are good to go. So. Okay, so I think Dr. Thakur lost her connection.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, I can hear you. And we can see your presentation too.
Okay, perfect. So I'll put it on full screen. Yeah, sorry about bit of hiccup. When I tried to share it initially, I just my Zoom crashed. I'm not super familiar with the Zoom. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here, first of all. And this conference is very special to me because this is being organized by students themselves. And it gives me immense joy to see how much enthusiasm students have, how much motivated they are, and how good of a job they are doing. I am seriously amazed at the quality of conference that they have organized and the maturity with which you all have handled this. I mean, immense kudos to all of you. And I'm really looking forward to what more will come out from Project Encephalon. So it's a great pleasure to be associated with this project. And today I'll be talking to you about the cell replacement therapies for Parkinson's disease. My research domain has always been in field of Parkinson's disease. That's what I have been working on since my PhD days. So I hold immense interest in this field. So let me take you briefly through this description of what exactly is Parkinson's disease. It's a motor disorder, as many of you might already know. Patients who have Parkinson's, they suffer from very typical motor symptoms such as tremor in their hand and feet. They often have problems initiating movements. For example, if they are sitting, they cannot start walking, or if they are walking, they cannot stop suddenly. Their posture is also, hunched, as you can see in this picture, and their facial expression goes down. They will lose their ability to do a lot of their basic tasks. As simple as tying a shoelace or buttoning a shirt, it becomes very difficult over time. And currently, Parkinson's disease affects 7 million people worldwide. And this number is only going to increase further because Parkinson's, or PD, is one of the fastest growing neurodegenerative diseases of current times. It's a neurodegenerative disease. What does that mean? It composed of two words, neuron and degeneration. That means neurons are getting degenerated when a patient is affected with PD. And this degeneration is different from death because death is a more sudden thing, while degeneration means these neurons are going to die slowly, and before their death, they are going to suffer from loss of function. They will have a lot of changes in the proteins they are expressing or genes they are expressing, and the function that they are performing, they will slowly start losing their functions. And this slow and steady death of these neurons make this disease a progressive one. That means the disease symptoms will go on getting worse as the disease duration increases. And the neuron group that is affected majorly during the disease is this small region called as substantia nigra. It is located deep within the midbrain structure, and it sends large axonal projections to this region called as striatum. And it is here that these cells release dopamine. In addition to substantia nigra, dopaminergic neurons are also present in several other brain areas. Very prominent among these is ventral tegmental area, which is lying really adjacent to substantia nigra. But surprisingly, despite being very similar to the nigral neurons, these neurons do not degenerate that much during Parkinson's disease as the substantia nigra neurons are affected. And this is a picture that is showing a real brain slice of a normal human brain and comparing with the Parkinson's disease patient brain. And here you see these dark pigmented neurons, which are of substantia nigra. And in Parkinson's disease patient, you can see a very clear loss of these pigmented cells. And as a result, the dopamine that was being released in striatum will be getting lost, or it will be released in a much smaller quantity than before. Now this dopamine release in striatum acts to regulate all the basal ganglia circuitry that is there, which is responsible for controlling the motor movements or fine-tuning these motor movements. And when this dopamine is lost, there are two pathways within the basal ganglia. One is direct pathway and another is an indirect pathway. Direct pathway acts to facilitate movement, while indirect pathway acts to inhibit movement. And a good balance between these two is very important for a good control over our motor movement. And when dopamine is lacking in this area, this balance is lost. As a result, patients lose ability to control their movements in a fine manner, and all these motor symptoms that I talked before, they arise. So neurodegeneration is the first villain of our story. We also see aggregation of protein alpha-synuclein in the brain, and these aggregates appear majorly in substantia nigra region, but in addition, it also spreads to many other areas of the brain, which cause a lot of non-motor symptoms of this disease. And these aggregates are believed to be pathological, so their presence will cause death of these neurons ultimately. So protein aggregation is the second villain of our story here. How do the patients who have Parkinson's disease are treated at the moment? We do not have any treatment for the disease. So what patients do is they somehow manage the disease with help of dopamine replacement. Dopamine, when given externally, cannot enter the brain. So a precursor called as L-DOPA is given, which can penetrate the blood-brain barrier. And it can help patients to quite an extent to manage their disease symptoms. But is it enough? Well, it is not. Simple answer. But why is it not enough? First of all, this is only a symptomatic management of the disease. It does nothing to stop the disease from progressing further. So cells will continue to die even if you are replacing dopamine and providing patients with some of relief in their motor symptoms. And even when dopamine is being given and some relief can be experienced by patients, it is not very perfect. Why is that so? Because when cells are releasing dopamine in the brain, a presynaptic neuron will come, it will put some signal, postsynaptic neurons are going to release dopamine, and it will be regulated in a very strict temporal and spatial manner, right? Where it is being released, how much it is being released, for how long it is being released. So there's a very tight control over its release. On the other hand, when we are giving it exogenously, there is no such control, right? It will just come from periphery it will not even go to the right areas. It will go everywhere in the brain. And then when it just starts to come in, then there will be a huge surge in the motor movement. But as it starts to get metabolized or degraded, then there is suddenly the motor help that patients were getting, it will wear off. So these fluctuations due to, these peaks of dopamine that happen due to exogenous application of dopamine in these patients cause a lot of motor fluctuations and are a source of major distress to patients, because they left home to do some task, midway they lost their dopamine levels, and then they are suddenly unable to perform their task, so they are stuck in that thing, right? So it's a huge difficulty for these patients. Also, due to non-specific release of dopamine in other regions, it can lead to side effects such as hallucinations, which is another major source of problem for patients. And even if patients are responding well to dopamine, and they can continue to respond well for several years, patients often live with Parkinson's disease for say 10 to 20 years because it's a very slowly progressing disease. So after 7-8 years or so, it varies from patient to patient, but after about a decade, this levodopa stops being effective. Why does that happen? Because the receptors that are there to absorb dopamine or show the effect of dopamine, they are also getting lost. Brains are plastic. So if these neurons, which are releasing dopamine, if they are getting lost over time, there is no need for these postsynaptic neurons to keep expressing these receptors, right? So over time, they are also going to be gradually lost. So then even if you keep giving this levodopa to patients, after several years, it is not going to be effective. So there is a definite need for, either disease halting therapies or something to modify the disease course to slow it down or do something. But if thing is that by the time patients are detected or diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and the motor symptoms become very apparent, by that time 60 to 70% loss of neurons has already happened. So it's very difficult to restore what was there once these cells have died. Then even if you slow it down, it's not going to help that much. So in that case, cell replacement therapy makes a perfect case in this sense, because you can replace what was lost, right? And lot of evidence was obtained from preclinical studies in late 1980s or throughout 1980s actually. Lot of evidence came from preclinical studies, majorly with rodent models, where scientists tried to inject these cells which were derived from human fetal ventral midbrain region. So this is the region which was supposed to become dopaminergic region in adult brain. So from the embryonic stage, this region can be taken out, and then it was transplanted in rodent models of Parkinson's disease. And this showed a lot of, tremendous benefits in these models. Lot of recovery in the behavioral deficits or motor deficits that were observed in these models could be reversed with these therapies. And these gave a proof of principle that, replacing lost cells, if you put them externally, will go and integrate in the host and also form functional synapses with these host cells. So brain is plastic, and this plasticity can be used to advantage in this sense. So fueled by all of these positive studies, scientists went and do some clinical trials. And in this way, a new star on horizon, our Bahubali, was born. Okay. And with this enthusiasm, scientists transplanted 2 patients initially in 1987 at Lund University. So this was the center where some of the early trials were done. In parallel, some trials were also being done in Mexico or China, but the Lund one was that received a lot of attention because of the way it worked and the benefits seen. So initial 2 patients didn't show much benefit because it was one of the very first attempts. Then scientists fine-tuned their approach in terms of the number of cells that are going to be injected in the brain, the region which is going to be covered for these injections. And with these improved protocols, 2 more patients were injected in 1989. And these 2 patients showed remarkable recovery. So in just 3 months post this transplantation, patient 3 showed immense clinical improvement. And when PET scanning was done for this dopamine in the brain, it was seen that increased dopamine is being seen in the striatal region, which was after 5 months of this transplantation. And because this was being seen at the site of transplant, it was believed to correlate with that graft is surviving, and these cells have started to release dopamine in this region. Patient 4 also showed very good benefits. In fact, 3 years after this surgery, he was able to withdraw completely from any levodopa. He didn't need it anymore. These cells were so good in releasing dopamine. And up to a decade, the patient had only very mild Parkinsonian symptoms. He could live a pretty much a very regular life. So this motivated transplantation of more studies in Lund, and 14 more patients were injected with these cells over the next decade. One thing to note is that all of these trials were done in an open label manner. That means patients knew that they are being implanted with the cells, and doctors also knew that they are implanting their patients with these cells. But the gold standard of any clinical trial is a placebo-controlled double-blind studies, right? So a patient doesn't know if they are receiving a control solution or a real transplant, and doctors also do not know the vial that they are injecting in this patient, does it contain cell or does it contain a control solution? So these studies started much later, only in second half of 1990s, when an NIH started to fund these studies. Prior to that, in USA, no research on fetal tissue was allowed to be funded because of ban due to ethical reasons. But in 1993, this ban was lifted. Then NIH funded 2 studies. One of them happened at the Colorado Columbia site, and another one happened at Tampa, Mount Sinai, and Rush Institute, these combined trials. One of these trials injected 20 Parkinson's disease patients who had severe PD with these cells, and they had 20 patients in which no cells were given, but they just received a sham surgery. On the other hand, other trial gave 23 patients these cells, but other 11 were just given sham surgeries. But little did the field knew that they were headed for a big disappointment, because both of these trials show practically zero improvement in patients. There was no positive outcome in this study. In fact, instead of any benefit, a large number of patients suffered from side effects, which was the graft-induced dyskinesia. So dyskinesias are very random, sudden movement, fast movement that patients are not able to control at all. And in one trial, almost 25% patients suffered from these. In another one, more than 50% patients suffered from these. So overall, the view was, when done in a double-blinded manner, these offer no benefit, and these cell replacement therapies for PD are not really effective. So this caused this field to die almost in its infancy. But scientists, they are more careful than that, right? So they tried with this Shivgami hand to try to save this drowning field. So what they wanted to do is they tried to find what has caused this trial to fail. What is the problem? What is it that we can learn from this trial? So as these patients were observed for longer time, scientists realized that long time was needed for these grafts to provide some significant clinical improvement. Initial follow-up period for these trials were just 1 to 1.5 years, which was not really enough for these grafts to show any beneficial effects. Also, there were some serious differences in the design of these trials compared to previous trials at Lund University. One was these US trials, the tissue that was transplanted in these patients, it was stored for up to 4 weeks before being transplanted into the patients. On the other hand, Lund trials were using only fresh tissue for transplantation. So it was used almost immediately after, in less than 24 hours it was used. So there were some questions that, keeping cells for long might have affected their viability, or if they are going to remain functional, or if they are going to offer any benefits. Second was that these patients in one of the trials were not given any immunosuppression. And in one of the trial, immunosuppression was given only for a short period of time. And as soon as immunosuppression was stopped, the mild benefits that were being seen, they also stopped kicking in. While patients in Lund received immunosuppression for a long term. So it was also thought that probably this difference in the way immunosuppression is being considered could also, make a difference in the survival and effectivity of these grafts. And later it was also found out that these dyskinesias, the side effect that was being seen in these patients, it was caused due to contamination of serotonin producing neurons in these grafts. So wrong neurotransmitter in wrong place was causing all of these side effects. And so it was clear after a lot of careful observation that this high variability from patient to patient and from trial to trial that was being observed is actually happening because the fetal material that is being transplanted in the patients is not very standardized, right? So this approach has potential given some very immense benefits that were observed in the Lund patients, but this approach really needs some proper refinement, right? In the meantime, when this field was lying in dormancy, what started to happen, these patients who had received these transplants in Lund, they started to, die of natural causes over their lifespan, and these brains started coming into clinics for post-mortem analysis. So then it was observed on the post-mortem analysis, this is a picture of one of the grafts, and you can see here in this circle the graft site, and all of these neurons which have actually survived in the grafted site, they are showing the marker for this dopaminergic neuron, that is tyrosine hydroxylase, and they are surviving, and they have formed connections, they are sending projections here and there. So it was taken as a very positive step that these grafts have actually survived 10 to 20 years in these patients. So there is a real hope in the field that it should be revived. But there was some practical limitations in reviving this field because human fetal tissue was being used in these trials. As you can imagine, there are a lot of ethical concerns with use of this. Many countries do not even allow use of human fetal tissue for any of the preclinical or clinical studies. And there are also, even if it's allowed, it's still a lot of logistical problems. So one adult, to inject sufficient number of cells in one adult, you would often need this fetal tissue from 3 to 4 aborted fetuses. Now to have that many fetuses together, all of them who are also matching the donor, the recipient, it's a very challenging task, right? It's very hard to find this together. And if you decide that, okay, we can transplant, we have got one embryo today and we can take cells from this one and then maybe try to inject second one later, that would mean subjecting patients to multiple surgeries, and this is a highly invasive surgery. It's not really feasible to subject patient to repeated surgeries. Also, standardization is a very difficult task. So the cells that, because it's only roughly that you can dissect out this region which is supposed to go to this midbrain fate. It depends on skill of the surgeon who's removing the tissue and the region that is being considered. So it's a choice between if you want to take a bigger amount of tissue or you want to avoid any tissue that are not going to that fate. So this standardization is also very difficult. And it's hard to design these protocols because it's not easy to obtain this source in the first place. And also scaling up is a huge problem. If there are millions of people affected worldwide, to obtain that much fetal tissue ever, to be able to make this as a mainstream therapy is never going to be possible, right? So in this regard, in the meantime, when this field was facing all these difficulties, was introspecting and was lying dormant, stem cell came into picture. So in late 90s, it was found, the stem cells are there. They can be, made available. They are scalable. You can renew them and easily replicate them, and you can also bank them. So this was considered a much better option, right? And in late 1990s, these human embryonic stem cells were characterized pretty well. And then a large number of studies started appearing in different diseases, including preclinical models of Parkinson's disease, which showed that, they can go and make authentic cells in the region of interest. They can perform the function that is required of them. They are pretty potent. So in this way, Bahubali, who was on verge of dying, came back all grown up and stronger than before in form of stem cells. But if hero is making a comeback, how can villain be left behind? Now this old familiar villain strikes back. These cells, these brain tissues that were coming from the patients all the way from the Loon trials. Okay, what scientists observed was that these alpha-synuclein aggregates, also called as Lewy bodies, they also are appearing in these grafted cells. Okay, and we know these are pathological. That means that these can reduce the effectivity of these grafted cells over time. But this was never observed in any of the preclinical models. And there's a reason for that, because the preclinical models that scientists have been using so far to test any of these therapies actually never used a model that could show any protein aggregation. They have been relying on a model which is based on 6-hydroxydopamine injection. What is it? This is an analog of dopamine. So when injected into the brain, it is selectively taken up by these neurons, which are expressing dopamine transporter. And it is often injected at this middle of these axons, which are going from nigra to striatum. So in the middle here, they form quite dense tracts, also called as medial forebrain bundle. So if you inject this toxin directly into this place, it will go and cause loss of these projection in the striatum region, and also cause a considerable loss in the nigral region. And this kind of, it produces a very complete lesion of this tract. This is a coronal picture of this region. So if you cut it in this manner here, one thing I would like to tell is this is often injected only in single side of the brain. If you inject it in both sides of the brain, rodents will actually die, because the motor impairments are so severe, they are not able to perform any of the task and they will die pretty quick. Injecting on one side is a good compromise, so they are still able to perform some of their basic function, feed and all. But on one side of the brain, you can see this is tyrosine hydroxylase staining, and all of these innervations on the injected side are almost completely lost in comparison to this non-injected side on the other side. Okay. But this is killing these cells with a bullet. But we know this is not how dopaminergic neurons die during the disease. They die more slowly. They will get sick. They will be, lying sick for several years, lose their function slowly. But despite of these shortcomings, scientists have continued using this model because it has one very good advantage. It allows a very quantifiable behavioral assessment. So there are two tests which give a very, very good assessment. One is amphetamine induced turning behavior, and another is apomorphine induced turning behavior. So it relies on just playing around with dopamine circuitry basically. So this is the lesion site. Let's say this is the left side of the brain, right side is the non-lesion site with dopamine system intact. And here you can see there's very less dopamine fibers surviving in this side. When you inject amphetamine to these animals, it promotes dopamine release. Since there are very few dopamine producing axon terminals present in this region, lot more dopamine will be released from right side of the brain. And because right of the side of the brain controls movement of left side of the body, it will cause these rats to turn in the other direction, because it is not able to move from the side that is contralateral to the injected side. So this is going to cause ipsilateral rotations, and these can be quantified very properly. And when graft is injected in these mouse models or rat models, You can see a very clear loss in this number of turns they make in response to amphetamine, thus telling you that, graft has been successful or not. Similarly, apomorphine-induced turning behavior can also be quantified. Apomorphine is a dopamine receptor agonist. When dopamine terminals are dopamine exons are lost, the remaining dopamine receptor cells, they will enhance the sensitivity of these dopamine receptors because they are trying to compensate for this loss, right? So even if small amount of dopamine is present, they will show much more response to that small amount in comparison to a normal intact circuitry. So when you inject apomorphine, these dopamine receptors will show a lot of activity, and as a result, rat will start to rotate on the other side, which is called as the contralateral rotation. And when graft is implanted in these rodents, there is a decrease in this apomorphine induced rotation as well. But this model does not show any aggregation of protein alpha-synuclein, and as a result, none of these preclinical studies ever showed an evidence that this is going to be a possibility. And then scientists are surprised, oh, this is happening in the graft. What to do? Is it going to affect the survival or functioning? And we do not know for the current living patient, are their graft functioning or not, because they cells were not good or they have got Lewy bodies in them. So what has happened here? Right. So for this, you need a good preclinical model to test and find out these possibilities, right? So these toxin-based models I just talked, right? Having good models in the field is therefore very, very important. But field of Parkinson's disease has suffered on this aspect because there has been a lack of good models which can mimic most aspects of the disease. Different kind of models exist, but they only mimic some features only partially. So other than these toxin-based models, there have been a lot of transgenic models which are based on expression of mutant genes that are expressed in PD patients. One problem with these models is that these genetic cases of PD are actually very few. They consist of less than 10% of all cases of PD. So even if we make these transgenic models, they are not representation of a majority group of PD patients. And secondly, even if you make these models, unfortunately, they just do not show any disease phenotype until they are very, very old. And even then, this disease phenotype is pretty mild. So these clearly quantifiable behavioral deficits are not observed in these models. Often aggregation is extensively happening in so many brain areas which are not relevant to PD. Also, the degeneration is very, very slow. If you want to screen or test your system, if you have to wait for 2 years of this mouse lifespan, then that makes this research very, very slow, and hence they are not very favorable to these kind of studies. Better than these models are some that express or overexpress alpha-synuclein protein with the help of viral vectors. You can directly inject them into substantia nigra. They will overexpress alpha-synuclein and they will kill these cells, and within 4 to 5 months, you can see a clear behavioral deficit. But one problem is that for these behavioral deficits to take place, you need to inject this alpha-synuclein in unphysiologically high amounts. It is not just as toxic as these, all of these toxins that I talked about. So again, what you want in a model is that it should be physiologically relevant as well, right? If it's just overexpressing it immensely and it's not really mimicking the true disease phenotype again. More recent one have been injection of fibrils that, alpha-synuclein is made into aggregated form already in the test tube and then injected in the rat brain. So these also show disease phenotype, but again, it's very, very slow. So similar to transgenic mouse models, you have to wait for up to a year or so to see any reasonable neurodegeneration and behavioral deficits, and which again make it difficult to use for these transplantation preclinical studies. So there was really a need for good models of PD that could show these disease phenotypes, but also do it in a reasonable amount of time so it can be used, right? So this is where I did a small part, or my tiny work in this entire piece of puzzle came into being. I was fortunate to do my postdoc in the lab of Anders Björklund at Lund University. He was one of the pioneers who started all of the cell replacement therapies in Lund, which I was just talking about. And when I joined his lab, we thought we should really do something about this model. And what we did was we combined the approach of overexpressing alpha-synuclein with the help of viral vector, but also using fibrils in combination with this. Okay. But what we did was we used this viral vector in a small quantity that when injected by itself, it will cause very little neurodegeneration by itself. So we know this quantity is not unphysiologically high. It's little bit overexpressed still, but still it's not, just a bullet dose. Okay. And fibrils is anyways very slow, right? So when you put them in combination, what happens is these fibrils act as seed, and they will enhance the aggregation of this alpha synuclein that was overexpressed with help of this viral vector. And in combination, they act to induce this neurodegeneration. These are coronal sections of substantia nigra as well as striatum. Only one side of the brain was injected, and other non-injected side you can see as a control. So you can see as quickly as 3 weeks after this injection, we were able to see almost 40 to 50% cell loss in these animals. And longer duration, we kept them cells. So in addition, we also were able to see aggregation of protein alpha-synuclein in its pathological form, which was quite high in this combination group at very early time points in comparison to either of the viral vector or fibril-based injection alone. Further, this model showed quantifiable behavioral deficits, which were observed in these two tests, which are drugless tests. So we don't need to inject apomorphine or amphetamine to see this motor asymmetry. So because one side is injected, only one paw or one side of the animal's behavior is going to be affected. And we could see this motor asymmetry with help of a cylinder test, where we are seeing that, if animal are using how much of its left paw or affected paw with respect to the unaffected paw when they are walking in a transparent glass cylinder. In this combination group, we could see a significant deficits in the use of affected paw compared to the other groups. We also performed another test, which is a stepping test, in which we restrained this rat in this manner as shown in the picture, but we left out only either their left paw or right paw out, and then we make them walk along the edge of a table like this. A functioning paw, they are going to make these stepping movements like this, but for a motorly affected paw, they are going to tend to drag their feet rather than lift it up. So we can measure the number of steps they are taking in a given length, and then quantify them, and we could see that there was a significant decrease in the combination group compared to the other groups in the number of steps they are taking. So after doing this model and this work, I left the lab to go on to pursue my second postdoc, but my other colleagues continued with this work to check out the cell replacement therapies. And this study only came out a couple of months ago. And here you can see these pictures of striatum. And to make a head-to-head comparison, they grafted these human fetal stem cells into these areas. And in the 6-hydroxydopamine lesion mouse, as well as in this mouse which were injected with this combination of viral vector expressed cell nuclein as well as fibrils. And this is just a marker of the stem cells. And you can see quite a good volume of these grafted cells in these areas. And when these grafts were looked at longer time points over several weeks, in both of these models, they could see that these cells are expressing all the typical markers for dopaminergic neurons, that is PITX3, calbindin, or GIRK2. So all of these are being observed. In addition, the best thing about this model was that they could observe that this alpha-synuclein aggregates have actually are also showing up in some of the cells which are present in this grafted region. So these are just close-up pictures of these cells where you can see this phosphorylated alpha-synuclein. It is present in many of these aggregated cells. So this gave a proof of principle that, if you use the right model, then you could mimic what was observed in clinic. So usually your preclinical studies inform your clinical studies, but this is the case where clinical observations are informing your preclinical design. So these are, early work with this model, and more work would be needed to see, if it is in the long run affecting the behavioral outcome of these animals, and is it affecting dopamine release from the cells which are affected by the aggregates or not. And this is just looking at the morphology and anatomy of these cells, but still the functional release of dopamine from these cells is also what needs to be monitored in further studies. But this is very exciting point of this study, and field looks at it with a lot of hope. Okay, so when all of this is going on and scientists are working, in addition, the stem cell field is also moving forward, right? When people are still working on these embryonic stem cells, field had evolved with more arms in its arsenal. So Bahubali has made a comeback now armed with cellular reprogramming tools. So what scientists can do now is not even rely on embryos for stem cell. They can take adult cells from fibroblasts or human skin cells, de-differentiate them into stem cells, which are called as induced pluripotent stem cells or iPSCs, and then program them into whatever cell they want, right? So they can also be made into dopaminergic neurons. And again, there have been some preclinical studies, again, only with 6-hydroxydopamine models so far, which have shown that cells which are derived from these iPSC cells can be put into these animal models, and they can show decent functional recovery with these cells as well. And this just doesn't stop here, because stem cell field has made tremendous progress. What is happening now is that these scientists can now even bypass this iPSC stage. They can just do direct reprogramming. So from fibroblasts, given the right factors, they can just make induced neurons directly. However, right now there is no preclinical study, no clinical study to show how effective these are. So because this is relatively new, but this has given a lot of hope. So this is very exciting due to two things. One is that when we are talking about these iPSCs, there is no need for this host to graft matching, no need of immunosuppression, right? So it's far more easier to do in that term, in that regard. And if we can go and bypass this iPSC stage, when you are going directly to neurons, you are skipping the stem cell stage. So the risk of tumor formation that you can sometimes can be a problem when using stem cell is eliminated, because you are directly getting only post-mitotic cells. So there is a lot of excitement with that. However, Bahubali's field is not really that smooth. There are still a lot of hurdles on its ways, because these are new. With iPSCs, there is a risk of tumor formation if you directly try to transduce them or inject them, right? Also, at the moment, it's immensely expensive. The media that is needed to sustain these human cells, all the factors and all of this is immensely expensive. And this is a huge consideration for a country like India, where patients have a huge socioeconomic barrier to access medical services, and then to be able to access such services which are going to be immensely expensive is not going to be easy for our population. So this is still a very, very difficult task. Another important issue still that is there is the variability in cell yield. So if you start with fibroblasts, this is also even though far more easier to obtain than embryonic tissue, this is still limited in the amount, right? Because your starting material is a human biopsy tissue of their skin. So it's not as bad as getting an embryo, but it's still a bit invasive. And then when you start with this finite number of cells and then you differentiate them, you even with the best of protocols that we have at the moment, you get only 30 to 40% conversion into the iPSCs. So rest of the cells are not differentiated. So your yield is pretty low. And then when you transduce these iPSCs into any other cell fate, for example, neuronal cells, yield goes down even further. So the amount of material that you are going to get is still, not that huge. So it's also still hard to scale. Also, because right now we do not have long-term sustainability data or patient studies and all, we do not know how stable genetically these iPSC cells are going to be. Do they still carry any tumor formation potential? Are they going to be unstable? Will they, the fate that they have been forced to go into, is that going to remain stable over several decades when these grafts are going to live in patients and all that? And induced neurons, which are just made by direct reprogramming, of course we currently have no data to tell how easy or effective that is going to be for cell replacement therapies. And in comparison to iPSCs right now, their yield and everything is far more, further away from standardization. It's far more challenging at the moment. But still, despite all of these hurdles, it is a very promising avenue. And these are still going into clinical trials. And one thing I must tell you is that clinical trials actually lag behind the preclinical studies by a long time. This gap can often be as long as 10 to 15 years, because clinical trials take a lot of time. They have to go through phase 1, 2, 3, 4 and all these clinical trials. And because these patients, in case of neurodegeneration, they need to be followed up for longer time to show benefits, right? These trials also take long time. So what was in preclinical studies today and what is coming out of clinical studies tomorrow, what is coming out of clinical studies today was something that was in preclinical studies 10 to 15 years ago. So there's a huge lag, and clinical studies cannot keep up with the pace of what is happening on this avenue of preclinical studies with advent of all these iPSC cells and all. So what has reached closest to the clinic at the moment is these human embryonic stem cells. So what scientists have, there is a huge consortium of scientists in US and Europe, which is called as FORCE-PD trial. They are immensely motivated by the Star Wars series, so they like to be on the light side of the force, and they call themselves as FORCE-PD. And they have succeeded in making GMP compliant human embryonic stem cell. So GMP means good manufacturing practices. So anything that has to be, pharmacologically level manufactured has to be GMP compliant. So they are made in that manner. So it has reached to the stage that you can order these cells, okay, and then a patient needs to be transplanted in some other center. These cells can be ordered. They can be shipped in a cold environment with a cold supply chain. They can reach the patient. They can be injected. So these clinical trials are in very, very early stages. And in next 2 years, patient community and scientist community look at these with a lot of high hopes that they might be able to bring benefit to patients. In addition to this, in Japan, iPSC based also just started. So that is also another avenue to look at very hopefully. But one thing that to note is that in spite of all of these advances, we still have to keep on with our research that is happening on the side of keeping up with the disease modifying therapies or something that can prevent protein aggregation or affect other processes that are going wrong. For example, neuroinflammation, oxidative stress, or mitochondrial dysfunction. Because as our medical science will advance, patients who are currently living with PD for 10 to 20 years, as their lifespan increases, they are probably going to live with PD for maybe 30 to 40 years, right? And in that case, the aggregation that is appearing in these grafted cells might play a bigger role and might act to disable these cells or reduce their functionality over time, right? So we still would need something that would prevent these pathologies from progressing further, so that once cells have been replaced, patients can continue to sustain the benefits for a longer duration of time. And with that hope and promise in the field, I would conclude my talk. And I would like to thank IISER Thiruvananthapuram and welcome Trust DBT India Alliance for funding my research and project. And I would also like to thank my lab, which is still in its state of infancy. I only have two master students in the lab at the moment with me. I still haven't met in person some of my lab members. So let's see how we will grow up. And with that, I thank and end my talk. And I welcome any questions that you have.
So there are a lot of questions actually. We'll
I
try to
the chat window. Let me have a look.
yeah.
Um,
We'll try to club a few questions because some of them were partly answered during the talk as well. So the first question which
just
we
give
have,
me a second. I need to.
yeah,
I
sure.
cannot see the chat box. I have to maybe stop sharing, I think. Okay, yeah. Okay, perfect, perfect. Okay, yeah, lots of questions. Maybe you could moderate and I could try to answer.
Yeah. So the first question and the following question is related to biomarkers. So the protein aggregates which you showed, at what time of disease progression do they appear? If they appear at early stages, could they be used as biomarkers? And there's another question by Ankush, in which he asks if PET scans or NMR spectroscopy could be used to better understand if a person is prone to Parkinson's at early stages.
Yeah, so that is one of the huge problems in the field, that we do not actually have any biomarkers. So we are not able to detect patients in the early stages of the disease. And thing is that PET scan for dopamine. Now, these scans again they are not very inexpensive diagnostic techniques. It's a very expensive technique to be used as a routine scan. So even if you want to start scanning random populations, so why would you make patient or people in general pay that much money to undergo these scans? And then how regularly would you scan patients or people with these things, right? So one has to have some indication to tell about these things. And another second thing is, because our brains are plastic, in the early stages of disease, brains try to run all sort of compensatory mechanisms. They try to uh, upregulate the receptors, or make them more sensitive. So they try to somehow make it work somehow. So that is why clinical features, its motor deficits, do not start to become apparent very early on, and which poses a huge challenge. There have been other trials. For example, some other retrospective, retrospectively, when you ask PD patients who are diagnosed that what are other symptoms did you experience, many of them report anosmia, which is loss of smell, and this has been very immensely interesting, because COVID patients, some of them are also showing loss of smell. So PD community is looking at it with a lot of excitement. Oh, is this predisposing anyone for Parkinson's disease? But that's an answer we might have several years down the line. We do not know it currently. And as far as alpha synuclein goes as a diagnostic marker, thing is, right now we are not able to detect in a living brain the aggregates of alpha synuclein, because for PET and all you need some marker and this ligand or something. So Michael J. Fox Foundation, which is a charitable trust run by Michael J. Fox, so he himself suffers from Parkinson's disease. He runs this charitable fund, which funds research. So they ran a competition actually to design these ligands for, labeling alpha-synuclein. Because this has been very challenging. I think it was $1 million prize that they put for this. And only early this year, 3 people together, not people like companies or groups together, have won this prize. And now they are on way to develop these PET ligands for alpha-synuclein, and then see if that could somehow be used as a marker. In the meantime, a lot of effort has been made that if you could collect cerebrospinal fluid from patients and then try to assess levels of alpha-synuclein in that. But so far that has yielded no conclusive results. It has not reached the stage that it could be used as a reliable marker. Sometimes it's seen to increase, sometimes it's seen to decrease. And then it's always a conflict about the species that you are going to detect. Is it monomeric? Is it fibrillar? Is it, some intermediate? So that's also a huge problem so far with this biomarker field. So yeah, I hope I answered all of these aspects of question that you asked, right?
Yeah. Another major aspect on which we receive questions is regarding the utility of stem cells. So, as you partly mentioned in your talk about tumor formation during stem cells, that is something one person wanted to know. How viable is it if it is causing tumors and teratomas? And there's one comment of why not using organoids instead of fetuses or iPSCs. So, are there any alternatives to, like, what might be the demerits or the merits of the stem cell therapy?
Okay. Yeah. So first I'll answer about the tumor formation aspect. Thing is, because if a cell is pluripotent, that is, it on forming types of cells, then what will happen is that then of course, if it is not controlled in a proper manner, there is always a potential that proliferating. Is someone asking a question? Okay. Then there could be a possibility that these cells could form tumors if they are not controlled tightly, right? So one way to circumvent this problem is that if you do not, inject these cells when they are in the stem cell stage, you convert them into the desired cell type first, and then only inject them. So then that circumvents some of these problems. But then it has to be ensured that, purity and quality control is very, very important, because if and in that case, the markers that you are going to use to assess that, this is the marker that is only present in my cell of interest and not in any other, even for neurons, right? There could be serotonin producing neurons, there could be glutamate producing neurons, there could be GABA producing neurons, and dopamine producing neurons. So sometimes a single marker could be present in the developmental stage of the neuron in many cells, right? So you must be using several markers and combination of several markers and make them go through several stages of differentiation to ensure that it is, indeed going to make bona fide cells of the desired fate that you need, and then do a very good quality control on them and only then inject that. So that would take care of some of these problems. And sorry, what was the second question aspect? It was about the source of cells, right? It was something about organoids. Yeah, so far organoids are used as something to mimic a brain in the dish. It's not really a source of iPSCs or any kind of stem cells. So because fetal midbrain tissue is directly difficult to obtain, these human embryonic stem cells, scientists have also been trying to obtain them from various sources, right? So this bone marrow based or dental pulp based, or something that is obtained from these pre-implantation embryo. So what is that is when, for example, you are doing IVF, right? So egg and sperm is being fertilized in a dish, and they will combine and form very early stage embryo, which is, you know, still it will undergo few stages of division before it is ready for transplantation in humans or female. So before that stage, it will often in IVF, they will form more number of embryos that then they are going to be used for transplantation. And only then some good ones are transplanted and rest are discarded. So those discarded ones, they can be used or are used as source of these stem cells. But again, ethical questions remain, right? Those are very difficult aspects per se. So in that regard, so even bone marrow is hard to extract. Then donor matching and all that has to be done, right? So this makes this keeps posing challenging questions to the field, and answers are not easy. It would take lot of work and ways. So probably iPSCs is what is going to solve the problem in the long run and going to be much more easier, but cost has to be brought down and quality control has to be done.
Yeah, I think we could take one more question because otherwise the next speaker is here. Um, so the speaker, so the question is that do we have evidence to say that alpha-synuclein aggregation is causative and not a consequence of neurodegeneration? So
Yeah, so this has also been an immense topic of debate in the field for years and years. So alpha-synuclein was, detected that it has any role to play in Parkinson's disease in 1997. So it's 23 years since then, and with all of these animal models, it was immense topic of debate. But in last several years, I think scientists have conclusively proven with a lot of cell culture based studies or monitoring cortical cells expressing alpha-synuclein with help of cranial windows. So with a scope, you're directly monitoring these cortical cells and looking at them over weeks and weeks. And then they have conclusively seen that cells which are forming starting to form aggregates, and then these aggregates will mature and grow over time, and then these cells are lost, so they will die off. So these type of studies have given pretty conclusive evidence that alpha-synuclein aggregates are pathological, and then they will cause cells to die out.